A close reading of the Homeric Odyssey, Episode 3, Book 1, lines 96 to 149. My name's Peter Gainsford, I'm a classical scholar in New Zealand, and here we are carrying on with our close reading of the Odyssey in Greek and English side by side. Now, last time, in Episode 2, we had the Council of the Gods. Zeus had said that Aegisthus paid the price for his crimes, murder, violating another man's household, seducing his wife, trying to put the other man's family line to an end. And all of these are at stake for Odysseus as well, as we'll begin to see today. Also, Athena argued that it was time for Odysseus to be allowed to return home. And, by the way, incidentally, we also had the very first appearance of the keyword nostos, homecoming, in the Odyssey at line 77. If you read books about the literary qualities of the Odyssey, you'll see nostos mentioned everywhere. Athena's speech made heavy use of wordplay, playing on the sounds of Odysseus' name, and carrying on the theme of attaching importance to moments when Odysseus' name is used. So there's a kind of a magic surrounding Odysseus' name. Finally, we saw the events of the Odyssey set in motion. Hermes is going to be sent off to Calypso to ensure that Odysseus can leave her island. We will return to that plot thread in Book 5. And in the meantime, Athena will go to Ithaca to set Telemachus in motion, Odysseus' son. And this sets off the story of Telemachus' journey in Books 1 to 4. Today, we are going to actually get to meet Telemachus. We're going to have a look at Odysseus' household. And we're also, in terms of literary details, we're going to get a look at a phenomenon called type scenes, specifically a hospitality type scene, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I go. And we'll also be looking at the relationship between the hospitality type scene and a real-life religious rite called theoxenia. Again, I'll explain that as we go. I'm also going to try and make some space to start talking about textual matters as we go. So, Athena is setting off to go to Ithaca, and we get a kind of a minor example of a type scene here. She bound on her, this is starting at line 96, she bound on her feet beautiful sandals, kala pedila, immortal golden, which carried her over the sea, and so on and so forth. She also took a strong spear. We get a description of the spear as well. And then she sets off. She went down, rushing down from the peaks, or rushing down along the cutter with the genitive, along the peaks of Olympus. Just in case you didn't know, Olympus has multiple peaks. So this is actually a true fact. Excuse me, I should say I have a bit of a cold today, so I may be coughing and spluttering a bit. I apologise. My brain may also be a bit woolly, we'll see. Now, this sequence where she puts on her sandals, she picks up the spear, she heads off on her journey, this too is a minor example of a kind of a type scene. Now, a type scene is kind of a set-piece episode where you have a typical kind of event that follows a specific sequence of motifs. In this case, putting something on your feet, picking up some equipment in your hand, and then setting out. We're going to see that actually at the start of Book 2 as well with Telemachus. He's going to do much the same things. I can't remember if we get a description of his sandals. I think we do, actually, but he picks up 2 spears. Anyway, be that as it may, this is a regular, repeated sequence of motifs. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that a type scene is just a dry, boring formula. It is a formula to an extent, but formulas carry meaning in Homer. Homer doesn't just... this isn't just a dry, boring way of cutting up the Homeric narrative and analysing it for repeated sequences of motifs. Homer actually uses type scenes meaningfully. This one, not so much. We'll see a better example in the hospitality scene that happens a little later. Okay, so she changes her appearance. She's standing at the threshold of the courtyard, looking like a guest, a domene xenoi, a man named Mentes, leader of the Taphians. Now, xeno here is a little ambiguous. It could just mean a stranger, but the Greek word xenos means also guest. So it transpires as we go that Mentes is supposed to be a regular friend of Odysseus' household. But we don't know that. Strictly speaking, we don't know that yet. At this point, it's still a slightly ambiguous word to use. And there she found the suitors, agenoras. We're giving a bit of a clue that they're maybe not the nicest people. Anyone listening to the Odyssey is going to know this already. They know that the suitors are the bad guys, right? You calling them agenoras is just kind of like a hint at that at this point, in line 106. It's not necessarily a negative word. It could just mean they're bold. In fact, that's how I've translated it in my facing translation. But it does carry a connotation that maybe they might be a bit too bold. It can be either positive or negative. And we get a description of what they're up to. They're sitting in the courtyard. They're playing board games, Pesoisi, line 107. They're sitting on ox hides, which they killed themselves. Now, again, this is getting to be a bit of a hint at the kind of treatment that they're giving to Odysseus' household. They are stealing his property, stealing Odysseus' property, ruining ruining the property that Telemachus stands to inherit. So this is a threat to Odysseus' household, to his family line. It's not just a threat to individual people within the household, they're also threatening the physical property. We also get told about messengers, house slaves standing around offering them wine and so forth, cleaning tables. This is an element that we're going to see repeated again a little bit below as well. This is kind of hinting at the beginnings of the hospitality type scene. And then we get Telemachus introduced. I think we'd better talk about Telemachus before we talk about the hospitality type scene, even though, strictly speaking, it's already started. By far the first to see her was Telemachus, godlike. He was sitting among the suitors. I'd better just read the English. Saddened in his heart, seeing his noble father in his thoughts, hoping he might arrive, scattering the suitors, making a scattering of the suitors, literally, the ones in the house, and he would hold honour and be in charge of his own property. This is lines 113 to 117. And while he was thinking this, sitting among the suitors, he saw Athena. Now, this passage it's caused a bit of trouble in modern literary criticism of the Odyssey, because the characterization of Telemachus is one of those things that not many people reading the Odyssey are going to agree on. And one of the most influential articles on the character of Telemachus is this one here, Millar and Carmichael, 1954. Gosh, that's long in the tooth now, 70 years ago. Millar and Carmichael cast Telemachus at the start of the Odyssey as kind of childlike, not really sure what's going on, uncertain, despairing. In fact, why don't I bring up the actual article just to see if I can. I haven't actually looked at this, so this may not be very efficient. But let's actually take a look at some of the things that they say. Well, yeah, what is Telemachus like when he first appears at the beginning of Book 1? First, we see that he is quite helpless. He sits in the Great Hall with the suitors, despondent, detesting in his heart the insolent young man. It has never occurred to him that he can do anything himself to remove them, so he dreams wistfully of the day when his father will come back and throw them all out forcibly. Boyishly, he longs to be famous, to have kleos, fame in his own right, and to be a man among men. But for all his 20 years of life, he has had no companion of his own age, and the only person to whom he can have talked as an equal is his mother. And what woman could refrain from mothering her child? Yeah, we'll get to Penelope in due course. The depiction of her in Book 1 is quite something. Let's go back to the text. So Millar and Carmichael set the tone, and I don't think they were the first ones to do this, but it's a particularly influential article because the idea of Telemachus growing and maturing throughout the course of the Odyssey is a popular one, and it's one that often depends on that kind of representation of Telemachus, that he is despondent, childlike, incapable. There is a real argument to be had about the way that Telemachus is depicted. On one level, yes, we do kind of see Telemachus develop through the Odyssey, but there is a real argument to be had over whether this is something that's actually reflected directly in the way that he's described, or if it's something that comes from the circumstances surrounding him. The plot of the Odyssey is the thing that is the means by which we see him mature. As the plot develops, his interactions with other people develop. We get to see more of them. That's the kind of development that he has on that viewpoint. There have been a variety of attempts to see an actual distinction in the kinds of phrases, adjectives, other terms used in connection with Telemachus as the Odyssey progresses. In particular, Beck, is it Deborah Beck? I think it's Beck, might be someone else actually, who talks about speech introductions in the Odyssey, and how different ways of introducing a speech indicate different things about the person who's speaking. And I'm pretty sure it's Beck. She argues, I think, that around about book 16, you start to see a development in the way that Telemachus's speeches are introduced, and there's an actual textual distinction going on. So on one level, you can, if you really look for it, you can find evidence that Telemachus is immature at this point. He's got some growing up to do. On the other hand, if you actually categorize some of the more narrative motifs, the way he interacts with other people, in particular the way he acts in a hospitality scene, you will see that he is absolutely consistent all the way through. So there is it's really a matter of interpretation, whether you see Telemachus as developing in his actions and the way he talks, or if you see it as growth emerging from his circumstances as the plot progresses. I tend towards the latter view myself, that the development in Telemachus that we see emerges from the development of the plot. And so you remember how in episode 1 we talked about the chronological framing of the Odyssey? Past, present, and future have already been decided before the poet begins. The chronological framing for the plot of the Odyssey is also the chronological framing for this development of Telemachus. At this point, yeah, I guess if you really want, you can see him as despondent, philon tetie menos etor. But at the same time, the first thing he does in line 119 and following is that he starts off playing the part of a host in a hospitality scene, and he does it perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. He is the ideal host, and what better way of showing that he is part of a mature community of people living in different places, interacting with each other, engaging in hospitality with one another, giving gifts to each other, and so forth. he is behaving like an aristocrat, right from the word go. So basically take your pick. You can have it either way if you want. Just probably best not to make the mistake of saying that only one interpretation is correct. So we'd better talk about the hospitality scene format a bit. I mentioned that a type scene is a regular sequence of motifs. Sorry, just keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try not to go over 30 minutes today. A regular sequence of motifs which you get in the same sequence, and this has multiple functions. On one level, it is a mnemonic tool for the narrator to be able to kind of semi-improvise the narrative as the narrator goes, so that you don't need to spend time working out every single line in advance and memorizing it line by line, word for word. There's room for a certain amount of quasi-improvisation there. At the same time, it also carries meaning, like I said. Now, let me show you the standard analysis of the hospitality type scene. This is from a book by Steve Rees. Oh, I did put that in the bibliography, the references section beneath the that are attached to this episode. Here we are. Steve Rees, The Stranger's Welcome, Oral Theory and the Aesthetics of the Homeric Hospitality Scene. So there's an entire book about these scenes. Here is the list of motifs as drawn up by Rees. And you can see it's pretty detailed. For those who are listening to this on audio only, let me just read out a few of the stages. I won't read out the whole thing because it would take forever. Step 1, maiden at the well or youth on the road. Step 2, arrival at the destination. Step 3, description of the surroundings. A, of the residents. B, of the person sought. C, of the others. Step 4, a dog at the door. Step 5, waiting at the threshold. Step 6, a supplication. Step 7, reception. So the host either catches, and you can have a sequence of subsidiary motifs here. The host catches sight of the visitor. The host hesitates to offer hospitality. The host rises from his seat, approaches the visitor, attends to the visitor's horses, takes the visitor by the hand, bids the visitor welcome, takes the visitor's spear, leads the visitor in, and then we get to step 8, seat, and so on it goes. And you can see this is tremendously detailed. There are 25 motifs in Rees's outline of the full sequence of motifs that you can get in a hospitality scene. Now, he's pretty cautious about how he describes it. This grid is, of course, a highly artificial abstraction, a mechanical device. And it's certainly true, you won't see every single motif in any one scene, but we do get a fair number of them. Let me see if I can illustrate by referring to the text of the Odyssey. So, we don't have a maiden at the well. We do have arrival at the destination. Back in line 103, in fact, she arrives at Ithaca. Oops. In the town of Ithaca at Odysseus' front door. We get a description of the surroundings with the description of the suitors and what they're up to. We don't get a dog at the door. We do get her standing at the threshold. We don't get a supplication. We do get Telemachus catching sight of the visitor. He doesn't hesitate, though. He rises from his seat immediately. In fact, we're told specifically that he was sitting down, remember? He rises from that sitting position, approaches the visitor, and line 120 here you can see he stood near her. He took her right hand, 7F in Rees's tabulation. He took her bronze spear, 7H in Rees's tabulation, and leads her in, and that happens in line 125 and following. He gives her a seat. Whoops. Sorry, let me just bring that back. There's he leads her to a seat, and the seat is described. There's a feast which is prepared. They eat the feast. There's a conversation after dinner. There's a conversation between the guest and the host. about all sorts of stuff. There's an exchange of information, and we'll leave the rest for now because that's not going to come up in this episode. But we get an awful lot of these motifs in the correct sequence here, and there's a lot of debate to be had over exactly what this sequence means. In the viewpoint of Elizabeth Minchin, for example, in her book Homer and the Resources of Memory, 2001, she argues that a type scene in Homer is an expression of what's called a script. This is a concept from cognitive theory. A script is a way of encoding information about a sequence of events. And the classic example is the script of going to a restaurant. If you know someone is going to a restaurant, you don't need to be told every little detail about what happens. When the waiter brings the bill, you don't have to be. It doesn't have to be explained that this bill is a reckoning of the amount of money that you owe for eating at the restaurant, that kind of thing. So you can fill in blanks as you go. Minchin's argument is that Homer is filling in those blanks when he uses a typical scene, a type scene, in this way. I'm not sure to what extent I buy that, because the whole point of scripts is that you get to leave out information. Homer does the opposite. He fills everything in. Just to walk you through the other two items here, the classic piece of scholarship that introduced the concept of type scenes was a book by Walter Arendt in 1933, Die typischen Szenen by Homer. But there's also another level of significance to the hospitality scene, and Rees doesn't cover that quite so much, and that is that the hospitality scene is basically a literary mirror to a real-life religious practice, theoxenia. Let me illustrate. The most detailed exposition of what's involved in theoxenia, or theoxany, it's often called, is in a book chapter by Michael Jameson from 1994, which I've given you in the references. Let me just read out to you some of what he says about the ritual procedure involved in theoxenia. Here's what he says, page 36 in his book, in the book chapter. There was another widespread type of ritual in which the Greeks explicitly honored supernatural figures by using the conventions of entertaining a guest. They issued an invitation, kalein. They set out a couch, kline, on which they laid out coverings, stronunai, stromnas. They put beside it, paratithenai, a table, or trapezda, which they adorned, kosmein, a term used also of preparing the couch, with, among other things, dishes containing food and drink. Sometimes objects representing the supernatural guests were present. And this is a procedure, a ritual procedure that was being done all over the Greek world. We've got lots of evidence for it from lots of places. The bit that I want to put to you is that there's an alternate possible, another possible way of reading the relationship between theoxenia and the hospitality type scene. What Jameson says is a type of ritual in which Greeks honored supernatural figures by using the conventions of entertaining a guest. Well, I think it's quite possible to sustain the idea that, in fact, the Homeric hospitality scene is an imitation of theoxenia, not the other way around. Pretty much all of these elements we get in a hospitality scene in Homer. And not just not just that, specifically in the hospitality scene that we've got here. The welcome at the door, the leading her to a chair. He led her and seated her in a chair. He laid out a linen first, beautiful and finely worked, and he pushed a footstool below. This is exactly mirrored in the theoxenia ritual, even to the bit about laying out a cloth on the chair. And then we have the attendants bringing food, wine, and other supplies, which we get in quite a lot of detail. If my suggestion has any merit to it, then you have to stop and consider, what if all of the other elements that we see in Ries's analysis, what if all of these are actually elements of theoxenia? This is perfectly possible. It's not something that has been taken very seriously in the scholarship, but it's certainly not without precedent. The idea of funeral games that we see in Homer, in Iliad Book 23, for example, is based on the kinds of athletic games that you get surrounding a real-life hero cult. There were also funeral games that were instituted in the Archaic period in imitation of Homer, but in the case of the funeral games of Patroclus in the Iliad, it's pretty clear that what we're getting there is actually a description of games surrounding the tomb of a hero in a real-life athletic festival. So the type scene, or in the case of the athletic games, the whole episode of Iliad 23 is based on religious practice. It makes perfect sense to see the hospitality scene as also an imitation of religious practice. It is quite possible, for example, that the trope that Rhys puts first, the maiden at the well or the youth on the road, is intended to mirror something that was supposed to be part of the arrival of the divine guest at someone's house. Sorry, I never actually explained this. Theoxenia is a religious rite. I said that, but it's specifically a religious rite where you're welcoming a god into your house as a kind of invisible friend, an imaginary friend. Although there might also perhaps be a statuette of the god involved as well. What if you imagine a procession of this statuette along the road to a particular household? The maiden at the well or the youth on the road could well be part of the ritual. The waiting at the threshold, similarly. And all of these other elements, all of these can be construed as imitations of a religious rite. A bit metaphorically in some cases, a statue of a god does not need to have a bed for a night's sleep, but a bath, that's realistic. A ritual washing of the icon is a perfectly reasonable thing to imagine in the context of a ritual. A visitor sharing in a libation or sacrifice, this is step 15 in Rhys's analysis. That's obviously ritual. So, this is something to think on. I'm almost out of time. I'd better finish up quickly. We do get another kind of a repetition of some elements of a hospitality scene in the very last passage we've got here. Lines 144 and following, we have the suitors come into the hall, all arrogant, again, or as I should have used, bold, again. That's the word I used to translate it earlier. They sat down, waiters served them, they poured water on their hands. On their hands, not for their hands. House slaves brought bread, they piled it up in baskets, and they reached the food lying in front, stretching out their hands. So that's all fine. That's a much more abbreviated form of the same stuff that went on with servants bringing supplies and laying tables for Telemachus and Athena, or Mentes, I should say. Let me offer a few textual notes in closing. First, do note that I've given you some bibliography on the characterization and maturity of Telemachus below, attached to this episode. Some textual notes. I've marked 4 notable textual variations in this passage. The first of these is at line 112. The house slaves wiped the tables, they laid them out, and they feasted on piles of meat. Nis don kai protithen. Oh, I know what's happened there. Ha ha ha. Sorry, I've just realised the accentuation is wrong there, and I know it's because I copied this from West's text instead of Van Thiel. This is the textual variation that I was going to talk about. Nis don kai protithento ide crea pola dataeunto. Now, that's the text in Van Thiel's edition of the Odyssey. In West's edition, we get these two words divided up differently. And you can see that here in the protιθεντο. Yeah, I'm again sorry for the incorrect accentuation there. Πρότιθεντο ide in the manuscripts is what we get. Also, we have that's the text that's given in one ancient witness. By that I mean a book that happens to quote this line. The scholia, or ancient commentaries on this line, and Thiel's text. That's pretty much unanimously the text. In West's edition of the Odyssey, we instead get πρότιθεν toide. It means roughly the same. What it really means is that you've got a different punctuation of the line. So let me just show you what that looks like. Here. So on the one hand we have they washed, the slaves washed the tables, or wiped the tables, laid them out, and they feasted on piles of a large quantity of meat. Or in West's text, we have they wiped the tables and laid them out. The tables, that is. And then, comma, they ate a large quantity of meat. This may not look like a very significant difference. And it isn't, really. The two alternatives do mean roughly the same thing. In general, if you're reading a translation of the Odyssey into a modern language, it's not usually going to be possible to tell which edition the translation is based on. I don't think you could tell with most translations here either. Sometimes it does become more significant, however. The main reason I want to attract attention to that one is because there's only one basis for that alternate reading, and that is the ancient scholar Herodian. Like I said, manuscripts, an ancient witness, and the scholia are all unanimous that it's πρότιθεντο ide. West basically is in the habit of always choosing the most archaic and the most difficult possible form of the line, and to an extent there's good reason for that. There's a textual principle of lectio potior difficilior. A reading that is more difficult is more likely to be the correct reading. But this reading isn't actually difficult. There's nothing difficult about either of these. It's just a matter of picking one relatively abstruse, no, that's the wrong word. One, he plays favourites among ancient scholars. He likes Herodian, but obviously he doesn't care about any of this stuff. It becomes even more pronounced in the other textual variant in that line. The multiple ancient witnesses and all of the medieval manuscripts have the word δατεόντο for they feasted. That is to say, crea polla δατεόντο, they feasted on large amounts of meat. West changes that to δατεόντο with absolutely no textual justification whatsoever. This is the kind of thing West does, and it's the reason I'm using Thiel's text. This is not the text written in any ancient copy. This is West altering the text to make it look more archaic. And I disapprove of that. There's a kind of idiosyncrasy or iconoclasm about West's approach to the text. He's a very radical editor. Don't think of him as the conservative one. West is a radical. In line 140, we see another example of this kind of thing. We have oodles of ancient evidence supporting lines 139 and 40. It's these lines here. Bread was brought by a dignified server. She laid a great deal of food. She was generous with the supplies. A scholion, that is to say, an ancient commentary, a really Byzantine-era commentary, tells us that line 139 is spurious. And based on that, West decides that line 140 is spurious. The actual basis for that is 19th century German scholarship. There's no actual textual evidence pointing to line 140 being spurious. But, like I said, he's radical. The omission of line 148, which I didn't even bother to translate, that is not radical. That is actually omitted in two ancient copies, two papyri. Some medieval manuscripts place it at a different point in the narrative, and it is basically universally agreed that that line genuinely is spurious. It does not belong in the Odyssey. This is not a case of oral poets coming up with different versions of the text. This is a case of medieval scribes adding in a line. This is an interpolation that happened in the medieval period. So that's the kind of situation where we actually do have a basis for removing a line from the text. Odyssey, Book 1, line 148 is not an authentic part of the Odyssey. And I've gone well over the 30-minute mark. I'd better stop here. So next time we will be getting onto the conversation between Mentes/Athena and Telemachus. So more on that then. For now, go and read some Homer.